Well, this one has certainly been a long time coming. We've known about the Dead Space remake for a while now, but outside of some developer live streams showing off early footage and that recent trailer, we haven't seen all that much concrete gameplay. That all changed a few weeks ago when press got hands-on with the first 3 chapters of the game, equating to about 3 hours, and boy is there a lot to talk about. Personally, I haven't really been sure how to feel about this remake going in. I think the original Dead Space is a masterpiece, one of the finest horror games you can play today, and despite its age, I think the art direction holds up and it still looks really good. Honestly, it's harder to see a Dead Space remake needing to exist in the same way as games like Resident Evil 2 and Final Fantasy VII Remake, which so thoroughly redefined their respective originals, both of which are over 2 decades old. So I went into this thing kind of wondering how it's going to justify its existence. After playing this remake, I wouldn't say my mind has completely changed on that front. I don't know if a Dead Space remake needs to exist. However, I did have a really excellent time with this game. I think EA Motive has nailed the look and feel of Dead Space and are bringing a bunch of changes, both big and small, to help create a fresh experience. I was super bummed when I hit the end of Chapter 3 because I just kinda wanted to keep going, and on a whole, it has me feeling really excited about Dead Space again, something I wasn't sure I would feel again after the disappointment of Dead Space 3. So if that's the goal of this remake, to revitalize the franchise and remind people why Dead Space is so damn good, then I think it's gonna be a huge success. So why don't we just dive right in, shall we? But first up, gotta let you know that while we did play the first 3 chapters, we could only capture chapters 2 and 3, which is why I don't have footage of the remake's chapter 1 to show you. So you might be wondering, what type of remake is this? If I was to be really reductive for a moment and create a line graph featuring video game remakes, on one end I'd have a game like The Last of Us Part 1, which features a complete visual overhaul, but is otherwise the same game we all remember. The other end of the spectrum would be something like Final Fantasy VII Remake, which completely reimagines the story, characters, and gameplay. The Dead Space remake sits somewhere in the middle. At its core, based on these opening chapters, the game follows the same beats as the original. The level design is mostly the same, and at least so far, the story is the same. But within that familiar framework, changes are made to either update certain elements to match modern game design or provide unexpected wrinkles to the gameplay in order to freshen up the experience for longtime fans. For example, our boy Isaac Clarke talks now.
They're out of fuel. The centrifuge is offline. We're tethered to a 4 trillion ton payload. Without the engines, it's dragging us down to the planet.
Can you handle it alone?
Sure. Fix the centrifuge, get the fuel running, then do a full restart.
This is undoubtedly going to be a point of contention for some people. Even back when Isaac got his voice in Dead Space 2, there was a large part of the audience that didn't care for it, preferring the silent Isaac of the original. I think there's a strong argument to be made for both cases, but for me personally, I actually really like that he talks now. It's not like they turned him into a never-ending quip machine, he just engages in the conversations when people call him. It just feels more natural to have him actually respond to people talking to him or expressing a personality at all, such as concern for the whereabouts of his girlfriend Nicole. It worked in the original when we didn't know anything about Isaac and he was kind of a blank slate, but now that we've had 2 games with him as an established character, I think it would be weird to go back to him being silent. It really helps that Isaac's voice actor returns for the role, making the remake's Isaac feel more connected to the Isaac of Dead Space 2 and 3. And it's not just Isaac, the rest of Dead Space's small cast of characters has been updated with new faces and voice actors. The script follows the overall same structure, but lines have been rewritten, resulting in characters like Hammond, for example, having a slightly different personality. Back in the original game, Hammond kind of came across as a hard-ass, barking orders, and trying to keep the mission going despite how fucked everything was.
We can still do this. Get me the captain's rig codes and we'll find Nicole.
But in the remake, he feels more like a guy trying his best to keep a level head and hold it together.
Isaac, have you heard from Daniel? We were attacked. She ran the other way.
In turn, Kendra isn't immediately as hostile and distrusting towards Hammond in the beginning. Audio logs have also seen changes, and in some cases, outright changed to be completely different. It's hard to judge right now how these changes will shake out. I don't think the original script and dialogue was bad, but it certainly wasn't the best part of the game either, so I'm all for Motive choosing to update it. The real question is whether more serious deviations will happen in later chapters. Of course, a big part of a remake is its visuals, and holy heck, this game is gorgeous. I mean, just look at it. Everything in the game has seen some sort of update, and some of the changes are pretty mind-blowing. The most exciting part about this is not just that it looks nice though, it's that these modern visuals can mix up and enhance the horror. The game is a lot darker overall, and that means more opportunities to show off new lighting techniques. For example, I really love how the shots on your weapon now light up the space around them, creating this really intense feel. I mean, just compare how it looks here with the pulse rifle in Dead Space Original versus how it looks in the remake. Something really important though is that I think EA Motive has nailed the aesthetic of the original. Remakes can often struggle to maintain the original's look and tone, going too far, or ending up feeling uncomfortably different. Not the case here. I just thought, oh yeah sure, this looks better, but this is what I picture when I think of Dead Space. It wasn't until I got home and compared the two that I realized how much was actually that different. One of the changes I quite liked was the inclusion of circuit breakers next to a lot of the power socket puzzles. When you place the power rectangle? Yeah, let's go with that. When you place the power rectangle into the power socket, the breaker will light up. You then have to choose where power is diverted to. The first one you come across teaches you the concept by having you pick between powering a door or an elevator. Then a later example requires you to turn on the power to a console, but doing so you have to make the choice between turning off the lights or the oxygen. The remake also lifts the control scheme and mechanics from Dead Space 2 and plops it in here. That means snap your controls using the B button as a health pack and stomp it on enemies to collect their goodies, something I actually forgot wasn't in the original. You might think how this affects the pacing of Dead Space, but because the remake was built around these updates, they kind of compensate the enemies for these changes, so I found the pacing and rhythm of combat to feel pretty much the same. I think it still has that slower horror pace that the original Dead Space is known for, and that's a good thing. Same goes with the weapons, which all feel good and the way you expect. An interesting change is that you'll actually find some of the weapons naturally as you play, rather than collecting their blueprints and purchasing them at the shop. For example, I found the flamethrower right before entering the area in Chapter 3 where the walls are covered in flesh, and they start throwing these little annoying guys that are best handled with, the flamethrower. I'm curious if this is going to be the case with every weapon, or if there will still be ones you pick up blueprints for. Blueprints for ammo and other items are still a thing, so it's not like you aren't doing that as well. So you might have seen the developers talk about how the Ishimura is now a more seamless map with no loading times, and you can walk from one end of the ship all the way to the other. And when I first heard this, I thought to myself, well, that's neat, but how does that actually play out? The original game is separated very cleanly from chapter to chapter, and you weren't even able to travel back to previous areas. Well, it turns out in this version of Dead Space, the good old Ishimura transit system is a bit busted now, which means instead they've added these new sections to help bridge chapters. For example, when traveling from Chapter 1 to 2, you take the service tunnel to get into the medical bay. Or for Chapter 3, you actually have to head back to the hangar and travel through a new zero-gravity area to get into engineering. I think this is a great change. Not only is it a neat way to help bridge the game together as a seamless experience, it also kind of breaks up the repetitiveness of using the tram at the beginning and end of every level. Now that said, once you unlock the train, you can use it at any time to return to previous locations. It's unclear to what extent you want to return to previous areas, but one reason might be for the new security locks. You'll find doors and lockers with a security level, and during certain story beats, you'll unlock higher tiers, and then you can go back to these locked rooms if you want to collect extra resources. These locks are basically replacements for the original node lock doors in the original, where you had to waste a power node to open up a door and, well, hope that that door had good stuff to find, because otherwise, hey, you wasted a power node. That means in this version, backtracking is more linked to narrative progression. I'm not sure entirely how I feel about this. I did sort of like the risk-reward of using a power node and hoping you got something good, but as long as it's balanced right, I think it's a fine change. Another reason to return to previous areas might be for side missions. That's right, Dead Space 1 has optional quests now. Based on what we've played, these seem to be pretty sparring, as there was only one side mission we encountered in the first 3 chapters. What's interesting is that this mission was actually about Nicole, Isaac's girlfriend. When you visit the medical bay, the place where Nicole worked, Isaac naturally brings up wanting to find her, prompting the side mission. This basically means going slightly off the beaten path to find hologram recordings of her in an attempt to discover what happened to her. This sparks a scavenger hunt that essentially encompasses the entire ship. I love the idea of using small side objectives to help flesh out and see Nicole early in as a character, which ties really well to Isaac having a personality now. I'm very curious to see how many of these optional side missions there are in the game, and how the potential for backtracking affects the overall pacing. I'm feeling really good about what I've played of this remake. It's pretty clear EA Motive gets what makes Dead Space such a classic, and I think they're treating the changes with a lot of care and respect, at least in these first 3 chapters. Intriguingly, when fellow GameSpotter Jordan Remake interviewed the developers, they didn't bring up events from the final 4 chapters. That covers the part of the game on the Valor all the way up into the game's final conclusion. For as much as I've praised the original as a masterpiece this whole time, I gotta be honest, the final few chapters are big stinkers for me. It's a huge drop in both storytelling and gameplay quality, and the conclusion is really lackluster. While this is just speculation on my part, I think the fact that the developers aren't sharing what the final chapters of the remake are like implies a much greater level of change for the rest of the game. That's something I would personally really like to see, and could be the thing that makes this remake go from a good update to the original to something that could even surpass the original. Maybe. Hopefully. We'll just have to wait and see for ourselves when the game comes out on January 27th. And hey, if you're dying to know even more about Dead Space after watching this video, I highly recommend heading over to GameSpot.com and reading Jordan Remake's impressions. He's got his own take on the remake, plus some insight from the developers. Link is in the description.